Hey, good evening. Welcome to this Geek Out session in music theory. We're going to be talking about note names. And so it's cool to see you on. Very cool. And if you're part of the replay crew, let us know where you're coming from as well. And we'll just jump right in because we've got some good stuff to cover when it comes to note names. Now, in music, there are 12 notes of the chromatic scale. There are 12 notes in the circle of fifths. We work with 12 notes. We repeat those notes across multiple octaves, but when you get down to it, there's really just 12 notes. And so what's awesome about that, I guess, to start with the positive, is that with only 12 notes, it's amazing how many patterns and permutations you can create to create all sorts of music. On the downside, it can be confusing because there are so many note names, well beyond just 12 note names. And so we're going to dive into those different note names to make sense of why we use them, how to use them together in different combinations, because it can get a little hairy pretty quick if you're not sure what to look for or how to make sense of it. So we're going to jump into that. And we're going to start with a diagram that we've looked at before, and it's kind of a nice home base from which to venture out into different areas of music. And this is basically a layered version of the chromatic scale and all of the hodgepodge of different symbols we use in music to label different aspects of music. And when it comes down to it, it's really just at the atomic level, music is made up of notes and intervals, or the individual pitches and the space or relationship between those pitches. Most of the symbols in music are labeling the intervals, and we've talked about that in other videos, and we'll dive into it more in other videos as well. But basically, the majority of these layers have to do with intervals because music is the space between the notes, as Claude Debussy once said. But here we're going to talk about the note names, because even with just this one layer of letter names for notes, it can get a little confusing. So here we have, you can see, and when it comes down to, at the core, the 12 notes of music favor the pattern of the major scale. The major scale is, in the words of Protagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher, man is the measure of all things, is what he said. And in the case of music, the major scale is the measure of all things, in that this pattern of whole steps and half steps kind of frames the way we think of and speak of music. And we're going to really pick that apart in this one tonight. So we've got, just to start, we've got C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C to repeat that octave. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C is the major scale. We're just looking at the C major scale, but these same principles apply to all of the keys, all 12 keys, because they're cyclical and symmetrical. But you can see here that the white and black of the traditional keyboard highlights this pattern of two whole steps. So a whole step, at least in the key of C, corresponds with each of these black keys on the keyboard. So we've got C, whole step, D, whole step, E, and then we have, oh, my half step actually should be right there in this image. I'm gonna have to update that. Then we have a half step from E to F, so from one white key to the next, and then we skip another whole step, another whole step, another whole step, and then we have this half step to finish out the pattern. And so this sequence of whole steps and half steps is the major scale. And on a piano keyboard, the traditional layout of black and white keys highlights that pattern. It's fundamental. Like Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. Here we're saying that the major scale is the measure of all things. It's the frame of reference or the context setting pattern around which everything else is described and perceived. So we have these letter names, and we have sharp and flat names for these black notes. So for example, C sharp or D flat are just two different names for the same note. C sharp just means above. So we've got, on a keyboard, we have C, And then a half step above C is C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and C. Or if we go the other direction, C, B, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F, E flat, D flat, and C. So we have C sharp or D flat. That's the same note. And here you can see that that note is the same. That black key between C and D is the same. Likewise, D sharp and E flat are synonymous. They're just two different ways of referring to the same note. You could call me Mike, you could call me Michael, and I'll turn my head if you say either one, because I could respond to either one, just like this note could respond to being called D sharp or E flat. But you can't just randomly say, call it D sharp or E flat in a given context, in a given scale, mode, or key. There are some rules that dictate which letter you use, and we're going to look at those rules. But on top of that, there are even more names for these notes. This is, believe it or not, the streamlined, kind of high-level, most common name set for these 12 notes. There are even more, which can make it even more confusing. So, but it won't be confusing by the end here. So we have most of the symbols in music are intervals. We're just going to focus on the letter names for notes. And let's look at, this is Protagoras. This is our Greek philosopher who said man is the measure of all things. Just to kind of put a face to a phrase. And speaking of faces, when I was putting this together, I noticed that Protagoras looks a whole lot like Stephen Wright. I mean, Stephen Wright. I was like, that is like Stephen Wright, a bust in marble of Stephen Wright. So whereas Protagoras said man is the measure of all things, Stephen Wright said the ha-ha and the aha are close cousins, which is actually a really profound phrase. This is a bit of a tangent, but Stephen Wright's brilliant if you don't know. And he's really good at taking two totally, seemingly incongruous, unrelated things and putting them together and linking them together. And that is, in essence, the definition of comedy, which is to have this unexpected turn. And then that's what makes you laugh because you're like, I didn't see that coming. Just like with the aha of eureka moments, it's the unexpected that leads to the expected. And so it's basically the same mental process of ha-ha and aha, and they are close cousins. Thank you, Stephen Wright and Protagoras. But moving on to the actual notes, they look exactly the same to my eyes. Okay, so we're going to look at the 12 notes of music, and now we have the chromatic scale that we were just looking at, like on the keyboard, where we have, the white keys, a block of 2 black keys, a group of 3 black keys, and then it just repeats. White keys, 2 black keys, 3 black keys, and so on. And so if we look at the chromatic scale here in a looped form, because when we repeat these 12 notes in a linear format, it creates multiple octaves along the line of a keyboard or up the strings of the frets of a guitar. In this case, though, because music is inherently cyclical, we can wrap that pattern into a loop and really start to wrap our arms and our minds around what we're looking at here, and make sense of all the enharmonic or synonymous names for the different notes. And so at first glance, this looks like a lot. And I have these diagrams in a post in the library, so you can take this in at your own pace. There's a link to the library in the video notes. But let's dive in, and we're going to start with, we're going to look at these different layers in splices to kind of take them in one layer at a time. But basically what we're looking at here is 5 concentric rings where we have the double flats are in this inner ring. And then we have the flat names in this next layer out. We have the natural names in this middle ring. And then we have the sharp names for notes and the double sharp names for notes. Double sharp is shown as this like little X symbol. And we have double sharp and double flat are relatively obscure. They're not as common, but you will see them. And when you do see them, you want to know what you're dealing with because they can be confusing if you don't know the logic behind how they work. Most of the time we just think of natural notes without applying this special little symbol. C doesn't have a natural symbol for the most part. It's just C. But this is the symbol, like in traditional notation and methods, to designate something that isn't sharp or flat, or double sharp or double flat. Okay, so these are the 5 layers that we're going to look at. And there's some interesting patterns going on here. So let's look a little further. And you can see that not all of the notes, like some notes have, like in the case of C, it has a B sharp and it has a D double flat, whereas this note has just a flat and a sharp, and this one has a flat and a natural and a double sharp. So why? Like, why do some notes have different symbol sets? Like I say, it can be confusing, but we're going to peel it back one layer at a time, and it'll all make sense. So let's look at just the outer ring right now. So all of the double sharps, okay? So basically what a double sharp is if we were to label this in the middle ring with C, this is a C note. It's the white key that is just to the left of these 2 black keys in a group. C, we have C and then C sharp and then D. So we go up to C sharp. Sharp just means raised a half a step from C. And then from C sharp to D, as far as letters go, we'd, go to D. But in this case, if we did a double sharp, so C sharp and then C double sharp, we get C double sharp. So C double sharp is just a fancy way of saying D. And we're going to look at why we would have to have a fancy name in the first place. It seems like it is redundant by definition, but it also seems maybe unnecessary, and just like now we're just trying to look impressive as musicians to have multiple names, but there's actually a reason for it. So let's look further. So that explains why that's a double sharp. It's just another name for D. And then likewise, if we had D and then we had D sharp, and then it would make its way over to E. It's the next white key. If we just kept climbing from D sharp, from D to D sharp to D double sharp, we get D double sharp. So D double sharp is another name for E. And going around the circle, we have E, and then F would be just the natural name for this white key. And then we'd have F sharp, which is a little bit hard to write upside down because I'm trying to write it, concentrically, with rotational symmetry. And then if we went from F to F sharp to F double sharp is just another name for G. And likewise, G, G sharp, G double sharp is another name for A. And then we have, this would be A, and then A sharp to A double sharp is another name for B. Again, we're going to look at why we have these duplicate names. It's actually beautiful how it works. But basically notice how all of the double sharp names, let me get rid of some of my scribbles so you can see this a little more clearly, that every note that has a double sharp enharmonic name is a white key. There are, you have the natural names that are all white keys, but then the double sharps all happen to be white keys as well. And that's because we start with a natural name, we go up to a sharp, which is a black key, and then we go up another half step, you get another white key based on where you begin. So that's really cool how that works. Now we're going to go to the sharp names, and you can see that two of the sharp names are white, and then the other 5 are black keys. And by black keys, I just mean like I'm referring to like the keyboard, just black keys versus white keys, notes or pitches in the chromatic scale. So B sharp is just another name for C, because we have a white key B, which is a half step below C. So if we go up a half step, we go from B to C, or another name, sometimes you will hear C referred to as B sharp. And that is not as uncommon as a double sharp name. The sharp names definitely are more common. So we have from C up a half step to C sharp, and then from D up a half step to D sharp. These ones are more in the realm of normal, so you're probably more familiar with these. But E, you have up a half a step to F, or another name for F is E sharp. And again, we're going to look at why we have these duplicate names. I'm just kind of laying the foundation of the different name types, enharmonic names, and how they align with the different notes within the chromatic scale. And you can see the same idea applies. We have F to F sharp, G to G sharp, A to A sharp, and that's where we get our sharp names. If we go to the next concentric ring of names, this is the one that maybe I could have even started with this one because it's the most familiar, but it's basically all of the natural names. Natural means no sharp or flat. It's just it's funny, the terminology used in music to say natural, it implies that the sharp or flat names are unnatural or some abomination of sorts, but it just means that they don't have accidentals. And even the name accidental implies that they're problematic when really they're not. It has to do with the major scale. In Protagoras' words, well, he didn't say the major scale is the measure of all things, but the idea of it being the major scale being the frame of reference, the context setting pattern upon which we compare everything else. And so starting with the C major scale with these they're natural because it's our frame of reference. It's the measure of all things. So that's how we're thinking of these letter names. If we go to the flat names, now we have from C to C flat down a half step. This is another name for B, and C flat does show up every once in a while as a name. D down a half a step to D flat. Anything that is a black key with the accidental is just kind of more, you see that more commonly. But to see that F flat is another name for E, because a half step below F is E, or sometimes called F flat. And then lastly, in this set, we're going to dive into how we actually use these symbols, but we have the double flats. And so it's the same idea as the double sharps, but going in the opposite direction. So C, another name for C is D double flat, because D, a white key, goes past D flat, a black key, and then D double flat, it's two half steps or a whole step below D is C or D double flat. And then the same logic applies to below G, a whole step is G double flat, below A whole step is A double flat, below B, a whole step is B double flat, and below E, it's supposed to be an E, a whole step down, or two semitone flat, the progression of two semitones is E double flat. So that's where we get these enharmonic names. And so if we go back to our first diagram, it looks like a lot. It's an eyeful for sure to have all of these symbols, but this is where we get C is another name for D double flat or B sharp. This note is D flat or C sharp, depending on the direction you're coming from or how you're viewing it. And then, E double flat is another name for D or C sharp. So you can see how the black and white pattern of the chromatic scale, which is really just a visual way of highlighting the major scale, and in this case specifically the C major scale, is dictating how the letters are aligning with either black or white keys, and therefore whether they're called natural, sharp, double sharp, or flat and double flat names. Okay, so let's look more specifically at how to use these patterns. And something that helps, actually, before we jump into specific examples, is with the colors and the shapes. The black and white of the keyboard is kind of like training wheels for the mind, in that it helps to tactily, with your fingers, feel around and allows Stevie Wonder to play the keyboard, for example. Being a blind musician, he's able to feel his way and distinguish each note from the others, because each note is unique within this black and white pattern. Within his mind's eye, he's also able to see the harmonic relationships between the notes, which is beyond just sensing the physical distance. Stevie Wonder is sensing the harmonic relationship and the musical distance between those pitches and the relationships between them, which is amazing that he's seeing it within his mind's eye. But if you're able to look past the black and white, that's in essence what the colors and shapes are showing you. Is it's showing harmonic relationships between the notes. That is really what we care about. So if you're able to look past the topography of black and white keys on the keyboard to see the actual harmonic relationships between notes, whether it's, C, G, and F, which are neighbors in the circle of fifths, or for that matter, B sharp, E sharp, and F double sharp, which are just enharmonic names for the same notes. Like, you can start to let go of the training wheels of black and white, and even of letter names for that matter, and really just focus on the actual relationships between the notes, which you can think of more quickly at a higher speed once you can even let go of the letter names. Like what we're talking about right here are mental training wheels. The letter names are a verbal way to refer to the actual notes, but ultimately what really matters and what we really should care about is the actual relationships between them. But it does help to have at least letter names and a verbal way to refer to them, to either communicate with other musicians or with yourself when you're thinking of the patterns, to say, okay, I'm playing a C. Oh, I'm erasing the C. Let me put it on my pen. You got a C, and then a D, and then an E, an F, a G, an A, a B, and a C to play like a C major scale. But what really matters is the harmonic relationships between those notes rather than the letter names themselves. There are a lot of letter names, a lot of enharmonic names. For the most part, like we looked at the very start, we really only care or not care, but we tend to think of these notes with just these names alone, just the natural names for what were the white keys in the keyboard, and the sharp and flat names for the black keys on a keyboard. The ones that I just circled are all the black keys. But there are different names that are used at different times. And let's look at some of the examples of how and why you'd used certain names in a given context. So we have the D double flat major scale, which sounds super advanced. It sounds like we're in some jazz, we're talking about jazz music or something, but really it's not that complicated when you look at it. So let's look at the D double flat. Actually, you know what? Let's start with C, because that's super basic. Then we're going to go back to D double flat. So C, there are two main rules to think of when and how and why you use different letter names in a given context. And here's what they are. In a nutshell, there are two rules for labeling the notes in a given key or scale. And they are: one, that the note names are listed in alphabetical order in a given pattern. And two, you don't repeat the letter names in a sequence, in a scale. So let's look at that, for example. So we're going to play the C major scale. When I say alphabetical order, you just start on that letter, cycle through the alphabetical names that we have for notes, and then land on the octave. And you never repeat those notes as well. So we're going to do C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We played through the notes. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We went in alphabetical order, and we didn't repeat any notes. We did repeat C because it's the octave, but other than that, like we didn't play, we didn't call this F double flat, or we didn't call this E sharp, because if we did C, D, E, E sharp, we would have broken our second rule, which is don't repeat any letters. So we called it, E was already used up as a letter, so then F, G, A, and then we're not going to call this A double sharp. Well, it's supposed to be a double sharp symbol because we already used A. So we're just going to call it B. Oh, B is available because we haven't used it yet. And then C. So if we look at this in the chromatic scale, we have C is our tonic, right? And so these dots, if you can see them, okay, good. They're showing up. We have a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Okay, so that's the pattern of the major scale. We're starting on C. So we go a whole step to D, and we haven't used D yet. It's alphabetically next after C. Then we go to E, it's alphabetically the next letter. And then F, we're not going to use the enharmonic equivalents of E sharp or G double flat because we're going alphabetically. We're not going to skip F and play D or G double flat, and we can't play E sharp because we already just played E. So we're calling it F. Alphabetically, it's next, and we're not repeating any letters. And then G is the next note, and we're not going to call it G sharp because we already just used G. And we're not going to call it B double flat because we haven't used A yet. So we're going to play A, and then B, and then C. So we made it. We went around the bases to make it home, to use a baseball metaphor. So that's the C major scale. We're going to look at this exact same pattern. It's the exact same pattern of whole steps and half steps. But now, though, we're going to start with D double flat, the enharmonic name of D double flat, if you can see that on the screen. So again, we have a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. That's the path we're following, but we're starting with D double flat. So we're going to go alphabetically. After D is E, but what's the E on this note? It's E double flat. Oh, okay. So it's E double flat. And then we're not going to call this E because we already used E in the double flat name. So F flat. And then G double flat. G is the next letter. We can't call it F because we just used up F in that. And then we play A double flat, B double flat, C flat, and D double flat. Now, it would be very rare for you to refer to this pattern as D double flat. You just call it C, unless you're a masochist and you're just trying to make things hard for yourself. But it is the exact same pattern. It is enharmonically equivalent. And using those two rules, the pattern progresses. The major scale is you follow in alphabetical sequence. Based on where you start, you go alphabetically and you don't repeat letter names. So let's look at that same pattern using another enharmonic name. And so all of these symbols look crazy, right? You've got like, whoa, like are we getting into the occult here? Like, what are these esoteric symbols? It seems like we should have a cauldron and some special potion because we're getting into some crazy stuff. No, it's just the C major scale of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. But because of the symbols we use, which are admittedly esoteric and kind of strange looking because of the time from which they come, which was back in the day, they are some weird looking symbols. We got a double sharp, we got a sharp, we got some crazy stuff going on here. But let's just start with B sharp. So instead of C, we're going to call it B sharp. So we've established B as the first letter that we're using. And then alphabetically, we skip to a whole step we can't play D because we just skipped over C. We still have to use C. What's the C version of this note? Oh, it's C double sharp, which makes sense because C double sharp is a whole step above C. It's another name for D, but we started with B. So then we play C double sharp. So B sharp, C double sharp, D double sharp, E double sharp. Oh, no, that's just E sharp. And then F double sharp, G double sharp, A double sharp, and B. So this, we could just call it C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, if we wanted to give our eyes and our mind a little bit of a breather. These symbols can make you feel a little bit sad. And these symbols are relatively pleasing. They're the same pattern. And so using that same logic, I just want to walk through a couple of examples. And like I say, all of these diagrams are in a post in the library, so you can look at them for all 12 keys. And again, remember that all of these letter names are like mental training wheels in that once you move past the mouthful of letter names that are just kind of helping you even grasp what's really ultimately a basic pattern of whole steps and half steps. It's just a major scale. If you can really get past, transcend the letter names and get at the underlying patterns, which is really what matters. Music is geometry, and there's this whole beautiful geometry, this geometric framework that's hiding behind all of this. But to get your bearings and to at least get your feet under you when it comes to the terminology and language of music, to know how these letter names work. And so now you can look at a symbol set like this and not feel sad. You can make the mental translation to the happiness of what it really means. So let's look at A double flat, an A double flat major scale. So the tonic is right here. It's the darker black dot. And so we've got whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And we're starting on A double flat, and this is enharmonic to G, if you can see that. It's basically a G major scale is what we're going to play here. So let's play it as a G major scale, and then let's translate it to A double flat, okay? So I'm going to disregard the red circles and just focus on what is the easier symbol set to use. So we've got G, whole step to A, whole step to B, that's a B right there, and then half step to C, and then a whole step to D, whole step to E, whole step to F sharp, and G. So it's on a keyboard, it would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. That's what that is. And if we go to this, it looks crazy because it's got all these double flats, and it seems like it should be more complicated than it really is. It's really just a G major scale, but let's get rid of these lines and let's start with A double flat. A double flat is a whole step below below A. A double flat below A. So it's really just a G. And then we have B double flat, which is another name for A, the second scale degree of G. And then we have C flat, and then D double flat, E double flat, F flat, G flat, and A double flat. That is G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. So those are the same. So if we have the more pleasing common name, like G, the G major scale, and we can just use all natural names, G, A, B, C, D, E, and then just only one sharp, and then G, why wouldn't we just call it G sharp? Well, we normally do. With double flats and double sharps, like I say, we don't use them as often, but you will find that, especially for guitar players and resources online for guitar players, guitarists tend to think in terms of sharps because of how they're taught to play guitar. So you think of rising up the strings is you have a low E. I'm playing this low E down here, and then the first fret is F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and so on. So you kind of think in terms of sharps. It's like this, frankly, a bad habit that begins very early on with music lessons when it comes to guitar, when really it's better to think of how can I think of these patterns in terms of the most streamlined way to like cut the fat. Let's get rid of extra symbols if we can and get to the easiest, simplest way of thinking of that pattern in terms of the letters and accidental symbols. And so in this case, G sharp is easier than A double flat, but because of the sharp-minded thinking for guitarists, as you start to get into some of these keys like F sharp, for example, it's actually easier to think of that key in terms of being G flat than F sharp. So let's go to, do I have it here? Oh, I don't have it here. Let's look at G. So we have G all of these are white keys. They're all white keys. And so, yeah, let's just use the natural name for those. And let's just, because we have one black key, let's use the sharp name for that. Instead of starting with the double flat, like we're already like signing ourselves up for pain, because now we're going to have flat names to actually make sense of that pattern. So that's one way of looking at it, is to streamline the symbol sets that you're using to just clear the clutter, clear the mental clutter, and make it less of a mouthful when you're describing these patterns. But like if we look at, for example, we could play, let me go back to my original because I don't have the lines on it, or I shouldn't have the lines on it. Pardon the blur. Let me come back to this screen so you're not getting dizzy. And come to this diagram. There we go. And I'll pull this up. Okay. So if we have, for example, F sharp. Oh, hold on. We play F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, and then we have B, and then C sharp, D sharp, and then we have E sharp and F sharp. That's one way to look at the F sharp major scale. Or we could play this pattern. Let's see if I'm going to use a different. We play G flat, A flat, B flat, C flat, and then we have D flat, E flat, and F and G flat. So we actually ended up pretty equal because we're just swapping out sharps for flats. But the problem with the sharp thinking for guitarists especially is, if you're thinking sharps, you're like, well, after F sharp, then we're going to get into G sharp, and then you start getting into double sharps instead of thinking. Oh, sorry, it's not G sharp. After F sharp comes after F sharp comes C sharp or D flat, and if you're using C sharp, then you're going to start getting, and then further up the circle of fifths, you start getting into more and more sharps, and now you're just accumulating accidentals instead of shedding them by switching into flat symbols. So D flat would be a cleaner way than C sharp to look at that key, and then instead of G sharp, you get into A flat. But I see stuff online that is framed in terms of G sharp, and it's like, no, don't do it, because now you're going to start getting into like a double F sharp instead of cleaner symbol sets. So like I say, all of these diagrams are in a post in the library where you can look at all of the, we're only looking at a handful here, but all of the enharmonic names for just the major scales to get your bearings and know what you're looking at in terms of all of these different patterns. So that is where these names come from in the first place, and why they follow this pattern. Has to do with the black and white keys. It has to do with the major scale and the positioning of notes within that topography of black and white, and using the major scale as the basis for every other name that we use in music. We'll need to dive into this more to make more sense of it, and especially to transcend these letters, because like I say, the letters are training wheels. They're holding us back from really seeing what really matters, which are the geometric relationships between the notes and the actual pattern. So let's jump into some comments here. Okay, so Jay, where are the colors? Yeah, so in these diagrams, I'm just focusing on specifically the names themselves. So in this diagram, and maybe I'll just do a whole video specifically with the colors to help like make sense of and use these letter names. What I'm trying to say is, like, I'm focusing on the training wheels of letter names, and not like jumping onto the 10-speed bike or the motorbike of what the underlying geometry shows us, because like my mind naturally wants to start seeing relationships between these, and start, looking at whole steps and like what those relationships are and major thirds and, augmented triads and all this stuff. And so my mind wants to get into the more interesting stuff if I'm looking at the colors, hence kind of the focus on just the black and white to at least get our bearings with the mouthful of letter names, if that makes sense. Jay, is it valid to always just think of C as always being the root note and transpose your instrument when you want a different root? That's an interesting question. So in a lot of the stuff that a lot of the illustrations I use C as the tonic or as the root note, just as for consistency as a frame of reference. But really all of the same principles and patterns apply to all keys since they're all symmetrical. And Irving Berlin, back in the day, he wrote like Putting on the Ritz and White Christmas, and he was a prolific songwriter. He actually had a keyboard that he had like a mechanical, it was basically like a really elaborate capo for piano where he like cranked something. I don't know exactly the mechanism, but he basically always physically placed his hands in the key of F sharp and then just let the tuning, let the hammers of the keyboard like move to play the different strings. So he just learns to play that one key. But I think it would be very limiting because as you start getting into modal mixture and, navigating your instrument, whether it's a keyboard or a guitar, it is helpful to not have to think in terms of just one key, because there is this intricate, interlaced relationship between all of the keys. Actually, in lesson 18, which I just finished writing in part 5 of the course, get into modes, and to be able to play within multiple keys is beneficial, very beneficial. So definitely learn all the different keys, and the symmetry between those keys will make sense as you play these patterns in all of them. Alapico, cool. It's cool to see you on. Let me change my screen there. So the no double use of a letter rule reinforces progressive consistency with the synonyms, nicknames of the notes. Yes, the goal is to have your mind instantly translate the nicknames into relationships. Yes, that, as always, Alapico, you always like cut through like to the point, which is exactly that. The goal is to have your mind instantly translate nicknames into relationships, and that's the point of shedding the training wheels of letters. So the letters only, like training wheels, get you up and running to think in that initial moment. But what really matters is the mental processing of the relationships to get to the relationships as you put in caps. So instantly relationships, to your point. Very well said. Yes, exactly. So Alpico, a person can go by John and Uncle Unkington and Binky and Susie's dad, but he's always the same person. Yeah, and he along those lines. So yes, Uncle John Unkington, commonly known as Susie's dad, lovingly known as Binky, is a multifaceted person, but he is the same person. But the way he functions, or to use more human words, the way he behaves and relates with people is different in different contexts, although he is the same person. So John might be, he might, be a little more reserved in the workplace. But when he's Binky, he's more of a silly dude, and he's more outgoing and has relationships with these other people. And at a family reunion, Uncle Unkington is, the fun-loving jokester or whatever. So it's like the context matters. And so the context in the case of music is the mode or the scale. So C, for example, is the tonic in the key of C, but in the key of C, it's the tonic, it's the tonal home bass, but in the key of G, it is the subtonic. Or sorry, the subdominant, and so it plays more of a backup role. And so even though C is C in the key of C, It's John here, but it's Binky here. And so it plays a different role and a different relationship to the tonic. It's well said. I love that metaphor. Dave Mercer, it's cool to see you on. Dave, wondered where the double flats came from. Yeah, so the double flats were, you've got a natural name, and then you've got a flat name, and then it's like not getting super creative. It's like, what should we call something that's a half step below a flat? Double flat. But yeah, that's where they came from. Sometimes the names aren't super inventive, and it's helpful that they didn't call it something different than that, which they very well could have when they came up with this crazy system of symbols. Peter, welcome, and it's cool to see you on. So why was C rather than A chosen as the start of the major scale when no enharmonic between when there is no enharmonic between C and D, rather than B and C, etc.? So that is a good question, Peter. So C, let me jump into well, I've got a whole lot of scribbles on this diagram, but you've got C, which is the starting point of the natural names. And so, we talked about the major scale. Well, let's come up to this diagram. Maybe this will make more sense. Still a lot of scribbles. Let me see if I can clean that up. There we go. So C, this loops around, right? So this would be a white key of a B right there, and this would be a C right there. So this is the half step right there, and this is the half step. This is kind of like the seam where we took the loop of circular pitch space, we cut it, and then we repeated it to repeat to the right or to the left. So why do we have this be C if we're, if the major scale of whole steps and half steps and the topography of the keyboard being black and white keys, why does it favor C? When I say favor, why does it treat C as the starting point rather than A, which is our, alphabetically the first letter? So it seems like this should be A if I'm rephrasing your question correctly, or if I'm interpreting your question correctly. So this has to do with the history of naming conventions and just the history of how scales developed, and how the Aeolian pattern or the minor scale was prominent in the early days of music theory. And so over time, the major scale became a prominent pattern and became kind of like the frame of reference that I talked about as being the measure of all things. And so C in that case became the star of the show or the measure of all things in terms of the major scale and treating it as a central point. It's tied to how C is middle C, as in music notation, the middle point between the treble staff and the bass staff and the grand staff. C is in the middle, and it has to do with that history of how the scales kind of developed and became prominent in how we think of them today. I'll have to do a whole video on that because it's a great question and there's a lot more that goes into it, but there is a history there and it's a long history. But it's a good one. Good question. Context matters, Alpico. Music is context. Yeah, baby. Yeah, context. Heard Gary Vaynerchuk once say that if content is king, which is a phrase, then context is God. Meaning what something is really takes on meaning in a broader context. And so context actually is more important. And that's definitely the case. We talk about space, planets or objects within space. If music was like, a planet or a moon or a star, then the vacuum of space seems like it's empty, seems like it's meaningless and you don't need it, when really that distance between objects gives context to the objects. It's only the space that makes everything make more sense. So anyway, that's well said. It is about context. William, in the history of favoring C, is the history of favoring C also because it's the one scale that has no accidentals? Yes. It's kind of like kind of like a chicken or the egg type thing in that C is favored, but it's partly, I'm not sure if it's favored because it doesn't have the accidentals, or if it doesn't have accidentals because it's favored. But for sure, C is, and that's part of why I use C a lot as an example in different, scales, or using it as the basis of, okay, let's talk about relative modes based on C in lesson 18, or chords based on that. Is it's so much easier. And that's why I say it's easier to try to trim the fat and think of scales in their enharmonically cleanest form with the least amount of symbols. And since C, to your point, William, has no accidentals, no sharps or flats, it is kind of the go-to. I remember my dad took piano lessons as a kid, and as I was getting into music theory, he mentioned that he favored the key of C, and that other keys kind of scared him. I'm paraphrasing, but basically it was just like, oh, they seemed like other scales, even G sharp, your key of G with one F sharp was a little bit like, whoa, when really it's the underlying pattern is exactly the same. The black keys don't matter, but C is seemingly easier on the surface. Max, cool to have you on. Thanks for joining. The C note gets me. Oh, I missed that one. The C note gets me started and able to learn scales because of the no sharps or no flats. Yeah. So, C is definitely a helpful starting point. And once you realize that all of the scales follow the same pattern, and the letter names are misleading, the accidentals are misleading because it's just about patterns, not so much about the names. It's just about patterns. It's like, to use the people metaphor that Al Pico brought up, is that, you have what really matters. If you look at two families, right, and let's say that they both have four people in the family, you have a mom, a dad, a son, and a daughter, and you have a mom, a dad, and a son and a daughter. Like, if you know that those two families have the same elements, and the dynamics between them are pretty much the same from one family to the next. Of course, you have individual personalities, and so you don't want to discount that. But if you look at, this person has red hair, and this person has distractingly strong freckles, and this person has body odor, and it's like, you don't want to get caught up in the specifics. Really, what matters is the relationships between them. They all love each other. They all have special dynamics. And so, so that's what I mean by the accidentals are distracting. That you don't want to give them too much weight or import, because what matters is the actual relationships and context. Alapico, loving the alchemy and metaphysics of music that you're showing us. Very cool. Yeah, it's with the metaphysics, everything's connected, as they say. Everything is connected, and it's cool to be able to draw connections between seemingly disparate things, just like Stephen Wright does with his aha and the ha-ha. Is that it's that unexpected turn from what you didn't expect to the, oh, it's like, it's enlightening. Eureka is a moment of euphoria, and the aha and the ha-ha laughter is a moment of euphoria. It's a very similar sensation. And so Stephen Wright is definitely worth mentioning. William, have you ever taught a lesson where you don't mention note names at all, but only intervals? Yes. So, I don't know if I didn't mention note names. I might have started with note names to kind of as the alley-oop towards the concept of intervals. But yes, there are in the playlists in the library under the theory playlist. I'm just kind of going off memory. There are some videos specifically about, and some posts that are specifically about intervals that highlight that context that we're talking about, intervals being context. And then in the course, in part one is about notes and intervals, the fundamentals about notes and intervals, and they do go hand in hand. But intervals are applicable to every key. They're a little more abstract, and we do think of them differently because we use numbers instead of letters. But yeah, there are some videos and lessons in there that focus more on intervals, and a lot more that we'll be doing here. So yeah, that is note names in kind of a bigger nutshell. It's not like a super small nutshell in that there's even more to talk about. Like there's a lot more to talk about. But that's at least an overview of the basic rules of letter names for notes, which again is the note names are listed in alphabetical order. Rule number one. And rule number two is that you just don't repeat the letter names. And where the enharmonic names come from has to do with that pattern of whole steps and half steps and how we label them in the chromatic scale. Using the black and white keys of a keyboard is a helpful frame of reference, but ultimately we want to get past, we want to transcend the limitation of the letter names and get to the underlying relationships, to get to that context, because that's where we really start cooking with oil, as they say. So thank you for joining on this one. This was definitely a geeky one, but it's the kind of stuff that people just want to skip and just get straight into playing chords. Just, I want to play chords, I want to play scales. But once you know at least the basic vocabulary and the logic of that vocabulary, you can become fluent not only with your mouth, but with your hands and with your music. So that's note names in music. So thanks for joining. Like I say, there's a post with all of these diagrams in the library, so definitely check that out. And we will be talking very soon. We'll be geeking out about some cool stuff in the next stream. I'm excited about it, and I'll post more on that as it gets closer. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, morning, evening, night, whatever it might be, and I will see you real soon. We'll see ya.